Alrighty, good morning ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my fourth video. There's going to be 6 in total. So beforehand we talked about algae, we've talked about bryophytes, we've talked about plants in general. Today we're going to talk about vascular seedless plants. So any plant that we talk about from here on in is what's referred to as a vascular plant. So vascular, for humans, animals, we generally hear this referring to blood vessels. Now, it's not correct to say that plants have blood vessels because they don't have a heart, they don't have that kind of system, but for plants, what they have is, it's all about moving water, sap, nutrients through the plant. So if you want to think of sort of vessels for moving things, that's what vascular and vascularized means. Before this, both mosses and algae didn't have this sort of vascular tissue, so it wasn't able to grow particularly high. So moving on, for seedless vascular plants, this is referring specifically to ferns. So seedless vascular plants, it has vascular tissue which carries water and nutrients much more efficiently than does any other bryophyte tissue, allowing the plants to grow extremely high. So what we're used to is, for bryophyte, it is usually less than 1 meter tall. So it can generally not grow much more than that, and when we see moss, it grows very close to a tree or close to a surface, and then it has those little sporophytes that grow out of it that got a little bit taller that I showed you about before. But from here we start looking at ferns, we start looking at trees, we start looking at bushes. These can for sure grow more than 1 meter in height. So evolution of a transport system. So big part of this, I'm going to talk to you about different things on how plants were able to sort of evolve this way. So first up, we kind of have a generalized term. We call them tracheophytes. So the name tracheophytes comes from a special water conducting cells they have called tracheids. So there's kind of 2 water conducting types of cells. There's what's called the xylem. If you watched my video about trees, you saw the guy from Veritasium, Derek, talk about xylem tubes. These are continuous tubes of cells that carry water up and down a tree. And then there's this word called phloem, or it's pronounced phloem. Phloem. And it carries nutrients and carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis. So the key idea is xylem is water, and the phloem is nutrients. Now, the xylem and the phloem make it possible for vascular plants to move fluids through their bodies while defying gravity, and it uses this sort of negative pressure. Now, one thing, just as an aside, we can't technically have negative pressure. What is actually happening is there are cohesive forces between water molecules. Part of that video showed how the water pulls on each other. So on top of there being very little pressure near the top of trees and ferns, there's also this sort of attractive force that holds water together. It's the same reason why you can float a paperclip on water. There's that whole surface tension that we think of. This adds on to the already very low pressures that helps draw water up these tubes. So negative pressure is sort of a fallacy here. There's other forces, but we refer to negative pressure because it can defy gravity and work better than if there was a pure vacuum up at the top of the tree. So I'll give you a cutaway of a tree. So the main parts that we're worried about or concerned with is there's xylem tubes, and then there's these phloem tubes. So basically the inner ring of the tree, they've kind of cut it away. is this vascularized tissue. It is able to draw water and nutrients up from the ground to higher parts of the plant. Now, one of the things about xylem tubes is that they're actually made of dead cells. So what ends up happening is, as the tree grows, it grows by stacking these cells on top of each other. Now, once one of these cells reaches maturity, it dies. So we can think of, there's all these cells below it. These ones are already dead. There's a new cell growing. If I go over a little bit, over time, it'll grow. Oops. Let me keep the same height. Over time, it'll grow, and then it'll die. But it leaves behind the cell wall. So the cell wall doesn't vanish, the interior components vanish, and this gives a continuous cell, I'll call it a tube, for water to flow. And you can actually see in this image that they have this multiple layers. So there's a primary xylem, a secondary xylem. We're not going to worry about that too much, but basically, as the tree grows, it's going to grow upwards. It also grows outwards, which gives this sort of annual growth layers. You can kind of see that there's these rings. We'll talk about that. That is something that ferns actually don't do. So we're going to stick with ferns here. So if I go back over, the next part is we're going to talk about specifically seedless vascular plants. So seedless vascular plants include ferns, horsetails, club mosses. So not trees, not any flowering bushes. We're still very simple in terms of an evolution cycle. So I'll talk a bit about what that means. First up, the life cycle of these seedless vascular plants. So like all plants, they have this alternation of generations. So this sort of haploid, diploid cycle. First change, the new dominant form is the Sporophyte. So whereas before we talked about algae, we talked about mosses, they were gametophyte dominant. Now the Sporophyte is the dominant life portion of the plant. So what we think of when we see a fern, or what we think of when we think of a fern, is this. This is the Sporophyte. The gametophyte is actually looks like this. And that doesn't look like a fern at all, but I'll show how this kind of plays about in their life cycle. The gametophyte, that little green thing I just showed you, is usually pretty independent and can photosynthesize on its own. So it can survive on its own, no problem. Now I'll show you what the life cycle looks like, and I'll point out a few interesting things. So I'll start here. At this point, we have a spore. It is haploid, so it only has one pair of chromosomes, and from this, we have a gametophyte forming. It forms this sort of heart-like structure. You can kind of see here it's sort of upside down, but most ferns have this appearance. We call this one a prothallus. Now, interesting things about this is that the spores, or ferns in general, we call homosporous plants, which means that their spores are identical. So there aren't male or female spores, there's just spores that come out of a fern. So this mature gametophyte the prothallus produces male and female reproductive organs. Now, one thing I'll put as an aside, they can self-fertilize. They don't have to, but they can, because they have both male and female reproductive organs. Again, they have sperm, they have an egg, so through their natural processes, the egg will become fertilized. This is where we get our zygote. This is our starting of our sporophyte. At this point, the zygote is attached to the prothallus and dependent for, I'll just say, survival. So it needs food, water, nutrients, all that kind of stuff from the gametophyte. Eventually, the new sporophyte's going to grow out, so the gametophyte is down here, and the sporophyte grows out. You can see both have their own root system, but over time, what is actually going to happen is the gametophyte will actually die. It's served its purpose to grow these new sporophytes, so once the sporophytes reach some level of maturity, the gametophyte, the prothallus, will die. Also, fun fact, brand new ferns, when they're still in this curled up form, are called fiddleheads. Once they reach maturity, they're going to produce spores. So you can kind of see here, there's a zoom in, these little things called sporangium that show up on the underside of ferns. And each one of these contains a bunch of spores. And once they're ready, through meiosis, they're going to divide to make a bunch of new spores, and the cycle is going to begin again. So one thing you can look for on mature ferns, you might see something that looks like these. These are the sporangium. And one of the things, because ferns are sporophytes, any fern can produce these on their own. They're not required to fertilize. That actually happens in the gametophyte stage. So you'll often see ferns where all the leaves, all the ferns will kind of do this at around the same time. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Stay safe. Bye.